On January 22, 1957, a construction worker named Leonard Prescott was driving down German Church Road in Willow Springs, Illinois. It was a brutally cold winter afternoon and the road was slick with ice and packed snow. Leonard was just trying to get home, keeping his eyes glued to the pavement. As he rounded a sharp bend in the road near a guardrail, his eyes caught something strange in the ditch just beyond the shoulder. He saw what looked like two pale, stiff figures lying partially covered in the snow. Leonard stopped his car, stepped out into the freezing wind, and walked toward the guardrail to get a closer look. At first, he assumed someone had just dumped some old store mannequins. But as he leaned over the rail and brushed away a layer of snow, his heart stopped. The sight was so deeply disturbing that he couldn't move. He ran back to his car, and before he could even fully process the terror of what he'd just seen, he sped away to find the police. To understand what Leonard Prescott actually found in that snowy ditch, we have to go back in time to December 1956 in Chicago, Illinois. This was a time when the entire country was gripped by a brand new cultural phenomenon. A young singer named Elvis Presley was taking the world by storm, and his very first movie, Love Me Tender, had just hit the silver screen. In Brighton Park, a working-class neighborhood in Chicago, two young sisters were absolutely obsessed with him. Barbara Grimes was 15 years old, and her younger sister Patricia was 13. They lived with their hard-working single mother, Loretta, and their 4 other siblings. The girls had Elvis posters plastered all over their bedroom walls. They played his records until they were scratched, and they had already seen his movie 10 times, but 10 times wasn't enough. On the evening of December 28, 1956, the girls begged their mother to let them go to the nearby Brighton Theater to watch Love Me Tender just one more time. Loretta, who worked tirelessly to support her large family, wanted nothing more than to see her daughters happy. She smiled, agreed, and handed them $2.50. That was enough to cover their bus fare, movie tickets, popcorn, and maybe even allow them to stay for a second showing. The girls, giggling and wrapped up in their winter coats, walked out the front door and headed into the freezing Chicago night. They arrived safely at the theater, bought their tickets, and ran to the concession stand. A school friend named Dorothy even saw them sitting in the theater, happily sharing a bag of popcorn, singing along to the movie and completely lost in the magic of the screen. But midnight came and went, and the girls didn't return. Loretta became increasingly anxious. She sent 2 of her older children to the bus stop, but the girls didn't step off any of the arriving buses. Panic quickly set in. Loretta knew her daughters never missed curfew, and they certainly wouldn't stay out in the freezing cold. By 2:00 a.m., with no word from the girls, Loretta called the police. What followed was one of the largest missing persons investigations in Chicago's history. Hundreds of police officers swept the city, combing through vacant lots, searching alleys, and questioning thousands of teenagers. Over 300 sightings of the girls flooded into the station, but every single one of them turned out to be a dead end. The case became a national sensation. Even Elvis Presley himself heard about the missing sisters and recorded a personal radio message, pleading, "If you are good Presley fans, please go home and ease your mother's mind." But the days dragged on into weeks, and there was absolutely no sign of them. Until January 22, 1957, when Leonard Prescott looked over that guardrail on German Church Road. What Leonard had discovered in the snow was the frozen, nude bodies of Barbara and Patricia Grimes. They had been stripped of their clothing, transported to this remote area, and dumped in the ditch. The news devastated the Chicago community, and investigators rushed to the scene. Under the direction of Cook County investigators, the medical examiner performed a thorough autopsy. But instead of providing answers, the results only deepened the mystery. The autopsy revealed that despite the girls being missing for over 3 weeks, they had actually died within 5 hours of leaving home on the night of December 28th. There were no signs of severe physical trauma, and the official cause of death was listed as secondary shock due to exposure to the freezing cold. As the public demanded justice, the police began desperately searching for suspects. It didn't take long for them to zero in on suspect number 1, Edward Benny Bedwell. Benny was a 21-year-old drifter who had recently moved to Chicago. Remarkably, Benny bore a striking resemblance to Elvis Presley, with the same slicked-back hair and rebellious style. He worked as a part-time dishwasher in a local restaurant. A few days after the bodies were found, the restaurant's owner contacted the police and claimed that Benny had walked into the diner on the morning of December 30th, accompanied by 2 young girls who looked exactly like the Grimes sisters. Based on this lead, officers arrested Benny and brought him into the interrogation room. For 4 long days, detectives grilled Benny. They kept him awake, questioned him relentlessly, and showed him photos of the victims. Finally, Benny broke down. He signed a detailed 14-page confession. In this written statement, Benny claimed that he and a friend had met the sisters at a local hangout, taken them out drinking on Skid Row, and fed them hot dogs. He claimed they spent days together, but when the girls rejected their sexual advances, he and his friend lost their tempers, beat them to death, and threw their bodies into the snowy ditch. To the investigators, it seemed like the mystery was solved. They had a signed confession from an Elvis lookalike, and they were ready to close the case. But then the entire narrative collapsed. When Loretta Grimes read the confession, she immediately and fiercely rejected it. She told the police, "My girls would never go to a bar on Skid Row. They didn't even know what Skid Row was, and she was right." When the investigators looked closer at the forensic evidence, they realized that Benny's confession was a complete work of fiction. The autopsy reports showed absolutely no trace of alcohol in the girls' systems, and certainly no digested hot dogs. More importantly, the medical examiner had proven that the girls died within hours of leaving home on December 28th. But Benny's confession claimed they were alive and drinking with him until early January. Realizing he had been caught in a lie, Benny recanted his confession. He explained that he was illiterate and couldn't even read the document the police forced him to sign. He had only agreed to it because after 4 days of intense, exhausting interrogation, the detectives promised him that if he just signed the paper, they would let him go home. All charges against Benny were dropped. Desperate for a new lead, the police turned their attention to another prime suspect, 17-year-old Max Fleig. Max was a troubled teenager with a history of violence against young girls. The police captain, Ralph Patak, was determined to get a confession. Bypassing Illinois state laws that protected minors from being subjected to lie detector tests, he persuaded Max to take an unofficial polygraph exam. During the test, Max allegedly failed completely and confessed to murdering the sisters. But because the captain had administered the test illegally, the confession was completely inadmissible in court. Without any physical evidence or a legal confession, the police had no choice but to let Max go. The investigation ground to a halt, and the case went cold. While the murders of the Grimes sisters officially remain unsolved, many retired detectives and crime historians believe the real killer was a man named Charles Leroy Melquist. To understand why, we have to look at an incredibly chilling event that occurred over a year later, in September 1958. A 15-year-old girl named Bonnie Lee Scott disappeared from her Chicago suburb. 2 months later, her nude body was found dumped in a remote wooded area, less than 10 miles from where the Grimes sisters had been discovered. Charles Melquist, a 23-year-old stoneworker, was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 99 years in prison for Bonnie's murder. He had a pattern of preying on young teenage girls. But the most disturbing piece of evidence connecting Melquist to the Grimes sisters is a series of phone calls. In May 1957, several months after Barbara and Patricia were found, Loretta Grimes was sitting in her kitchen when the phone rang. She picked it up, and a calm, terrifying male voice on the other end spoke. The man boasted that he was the one who had stripped and killed her daughters. He then mentioned a highly specific detail, that one of her daughters had a unique physical deformity, a crossed toe. This detail had been carefully withheld by investigators and was never released to the media or the public. Only the killer could have known it. Then, the day after Bonnie Lee Scott's body was discovered in 1958, Loretta Grimes received another phone call. The exact same voice on the other end said, I've committed another perfect crime. This is another one those cops won't solve. Loretta was absolutely certain until her dying day that the voice belonged to the man who murdered her daughters. However, Charles Melquist's defense attorney strictly prohibited the police from ever questioning him about the Grimes sisters. And because there was no physical evidence left behind at the scene in 1956, Melquist was never formally charged with their murders. He served a portion of his sentence for the murder of Bonnie Lee Scott and was eventually released. Charles Melquist died in 2010, taking whatever secrets he had to his grave. The tragedy of the Grimes sisters forever changed the city of Chicago, shattering the post-war innocence of a generation and leaving a family to spend the rest of their lives mourning two young girls who just wanted to see an Elvis movie on a cold winter night and never came home. The Black Dahlia, 1947, USA. On January 15, 1947, a local resident named Betty Bersinger was walking down a sidewalk in Leimert Park, Los Angeles. It was a crisp, pleasant morning, and Betty was pushing her 3-year-old daughter in a stroller, heading toward a local shoe repair shop. As she walked past a vacant lot covered in overgrown weeds, she noticed something pale lying in the grass just a few feet away. At first, Betty thought someone had dumped a broken store mannequin, sliced clean in half at the waist. She stopped the stroller and walked a few steps closer, curious as to why someone would leave trash out in the open like that. But as her eyes adjusted to the shadows in the tall weeds, her heart dropped. The sheer, unimaginable horror of what she was looking at made her freeze. She grabbed her daughter's stroller, turned around, and ran screaming toward the nearest house to call the police. To understand what Betty Bersinger actually stumbled upon in that vacant lot, we have to go back in time to the early 1940s and meet a young woman named Elizabeth Short. Elizabeth was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and grew up to be an exceptionally beautiful young woman with striking blue eyes, pale skin, and jet black hair. But her life was far from easy. During the Great Depression, her father abandoned the family, leaving her mother to raise Elizabeth and her 4 sisters entirely on her own. On top of that, Elizabeth suffered from severe respiratory issues and bronchitis, which meant she had to spend the cold winters in warmer climates like Florida. But Elizabeth was a dreamer. She was absolutely captivated by the glamour of the movies, and she wanted nothing more than to be an actress. In her early 20s, she packed her bags and headed west to California, chasing the dream of seeing her name in lights. But 1940s Hollywood was a tough, unforgiving place for young, hopeful girls. Elizabeth took odd jobs, worked as a waitress, and struggled constantly to pay her rent. She often bounced around, staying in cheap hotels or crash pads with friends. Despite her financial struggles, Elizabeth always tried to present herself with elegance. She was known for wearing beautiful, tailored black outfits, often pinning a striking white flower in her dark hair. Because of her dramatic style and her love for dark clothing, people around town began affectionately calling her the Black Dahlia. In late 1946, Elizabeth met a handsome salesman named Robert "Red" Manley. Red was married, but he was instantly captivated by Elizabeth's charm and beauty. He felt sorry for her and wanted to help her out, so he paid for her hotel room and drove her around town. On January 9th, 1947, Red picked Elizabeth up from a hotel in San Diego and drove her back to Los Angeles. He dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel, where she told him she was meeting her sister. Red watched her walk into the lobby, waved goodbye, and drove away. That was the last time anyone ever saw Elizabeth Short alive. 6 days later, on January 15th, Betty Bersinger made her horrifying discovery in that vacant lot on South Norton Avenue. When the first police officers arrived at the scene, they were stunned. The seasoned detective Harry Hansen was assigned to lead the investigation. Hansen had seen a lot of terrible things in his career, but nothing could have prepared him for what he saw in that field. The body of 22-year-old Elizabeth Short was not just dumped. It had been subjected to unspeakable mutilation. She was sliced completely in half at the waist. Her body had been thoroughly drained of blood, scrubbed clean, and posed in a precise, disturbing manner. Her face had been slashed from the corners of her mouth all the way to her ears, leaving her with a terrifying, permanent ear-to-ear smile. The brutality of the crime suggested a deep, personal hatred. Detective Hansen immediately began searching for anyone who had been close to Elizabeth. It didn't take them long to find Red Manley. He was the last known person to have seen her alive. He was married, had a highly complicated relationship with Elizabeth, and his timeline of dropping her off at the hotel seemed incredibly convenient. The police brought Red in for intense questioning. Hansen grilled him for hours, pointing out minor inconsistencies in his travel logs. To the detectives, it seemed like an open and shut case. Red must have snapped, taken Elizabeth to a private location, murdered her, and carefully dumped her body. But then, the entire theory fell apart. Red Manley cooperated fully. He agreed to take a polygraph test, not just once, but twice, and passed both with flying colors. Furthermore, his alibi for the days surrounding the murder was completely airtight. He was miles away, working and spending time with his family. The police had absolutely no choice but to release him. The investigation hit a massive brick wall. Over the next few weeks, dozens of people walked into police stations confessing to the murder, desperate for a taste of Hollywood fame. But Hansen quickly realized none of them knew the secret details of the crime scene that only the killer would know. Then, a bizarre and chilling twist occurred. On January 21st, a cardboard box was delivered to the Los Angeles Examiner. Inside, the newspaper staff found a collection of Elizabeth Short's most personal belongings: her birth certificate, photographs, an address book, and her business cards. The letter accompanying the package was made of words cut out from newspapers. It read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." It was signed, "The Black Dahlia Avenger." The police realized they were dealing with a highly intelligent, arrogant killer who was actively playing a game with them. Soon after, the medical examiner dropped another bombshell clue. The clean cut that had severed Elizabeth's body was a professional hemicorporectomy. The killer hadn't just hacked her in half. They had used advanced, precise surgical techniques. The cut went perfectly between the lumbar vertebrae without damaging any of her internal organs. This meant the killer was almost certainly a trained medical professional with access to surgical equipment. While the murder of the Black Dahlia officially remains unsolved, decades later, a retired LAPD homicide detective named Steve Hodel made a shocking discovery. While going through his deceased father's personal belongings, Steve found 2 photographs of a beautiful young woman who looked exactly like Elizabeth Short. His father, Dr. George Hodel, was a highly respected, brilliant, but deeply eccentric Los Angeles physician in the 1940s. Dr. George Hodel ran a private clinic associated with the Hollywood elite and was a highly skilled surgeon. Steve Hodel began investigating his own father and uncovered a mountain of chilling evidence. It turned out that during the original 1947 investigation, Dr. George Hodel was actually one of the primary suspects. The police had even gone so far as to bug his home. On those secret recordings, they heard Dr. Hodel say, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." His secretary had died of a highly suspicious drug overdose shortly after Elizabeth's murder. But in 1947, Dr. George Hodel was a powerful man. He used his wealth, high society connections, and influence within a deeply corrupt police department to completely bury the investigation. Shortly after the police began closing in on him, he fled the United States to the Philippines, where he lived for decades. If the theories are correct, on that dark night in January 1947, Dr. Hoddle lured the trusting, vulnerable Elizabeth to his grand, Mayan-style mansion. Utilizing his cold clinical surgical skills, he tortured and dismantled her, treating her not as a human being, but as a twisted canvas for his dark desires, completely confident that his genius and status would shield him from justice. And he was right. Dr. George Hoddle died in 2001 at the age of 93, never having spent a single day in prison for the murder of Elizabeth Short. The tragic death of the Black Dahlia remains one of the most famous and haunting mysteries in American history. Elizabeth Short came to Los Angeles chasing a dream of stardom, only to have her life stolen by a monster, leaving behind a legacy of sorrow and a mystery that continues to haunt the world to this day.